Well, hello. Welcome to Making Cancer Fun. I'm really excited today. So we're pre-recording this. We are not live. So I know it's a little bit different for us, but I'm super excited to finally get to bring this beautiful woman on. So we're here today with Adriana, and she is, oh my gosh, she's got her hands in so many different things. She has a podcast. She has a Facebook group that she's running. She's got a blog, and it's all called Family Chemotherapy. So obviously in the notes section, you'll be able to find her and find everything. But I think it's pretty cool that she's reaching people in all these different ways. And she is a very big proponent of the mental health piece for families that are affected by childhood cancer. And so you guys know this is our jam here in Making Cancer Fun. It's all about how do you cope? How do you get through this? Emotionally, mentally, the things that we have control over, because we don't necessarily have control over the physical piece, and what's happening there. And so I'm excited that you're here and you're going to be sharing your wisdom. So to kind of start, can you just tell everybody a little bit about you, your backstory, how you kind of ended up in the Club Cancer place?
Yeah, the club that nobody wants to be a part of, but once you're here, you just love all the people. So a little bit about me, licensed professional counselor in the state of Texas. And I'm going to really summarize my child's, journey, cancer story, basically, of diagnosis as fast as I can, because it can be really long. But basically, after a month of being misdiagnosed, and being pushed aside by multiple doctors, we finally got one doctor to do an MRI on him. We found out it was the evening before Thanksgiving. We did the MRI. It was late in the afternoon. Poor kid didn't have a single thing to eat all day, because his MRI was at 2 p.m. and they were like, he can't eat past 8 a.m.
Yeah.
So we do the MRI. We are on our way home. They tell us, you need to go to the hospital. It looks indicative of rhabdomyosarcoma, which is a solid tumor. And it's really important, time is of essence. You need to go to the hospital right now. I will call them, whatever, right? So we head out to the hospital. Didn't get my kid lunch. I've never done emergency room, so I didn't expect to be there 4 or 5 hours. It was a brand new world, brand new experience. We take my child to the hospital. We find out that because everybody was on vacation, it was midnight. At this point, it was 5 p.m. Between 5 p.m. and midnight, we were there at the hospital, and nobody was able to help us because everybody was out, for Thanksgiving. So we ended up in Houston to see if we could find someone who would be willing to do a biopsy and potentially come in on their day off. And we ended up starting chemo there in Houston. We lived there for about 6 weeks. And then we came home, and we were in Dallas, and we did treatment. He did treatment for rhabdo for almost 11 months. It's technically like a 42-week, but he had a lot of delays because of meeting counts and stuff. And so it was about a month later than anticipated. And during that process, so as a mental health professional, going through this, I had actually just lost my brother about a year before that. And so I honestly thought, before my child was diagnosed, I was like, there's no way that my kid could have cancer. My brother just passed away. There's no way that I'm a spiritual person. So I was like, there's no way God would do this, right? And immediately after I would say that, the thought in my mind was always, there is no quota for suffering. You haven't met a quota. There is no quota for suffering.
Wow.
So I would hear that message in my head every time, and I'm like, dang it. Surely it's not cancer, right? Brush it aside. So all that being said, basically, once he got diagnosed, I just finished healing, the whole grieving part. I literally went back to work for 1 week to start taking clients again. I was like, okay, I think I'm ready. I think I'm ready at a point where my kids were settled enough, because at that point I have 3 kids, if I didn't mention that. So I have a 6-year-old, my warrior is 5 years old, and then my daughter is 3. But at the diagnosis time, she was just about to turn 2, right? So it was a little chaotic.
How old was your son when he was diagnosed?
He was diagnosed right before his 4th birthday. It was 1 month away from his 4th birthday. So It was a little chaotic, trying to go back to work and the scheduling and all that other stuff. And so I finally went back to work. And then a week later, we find out, he has cancer. And I'm like, I'm so sorry. I know I just came back from a very, very extended maternity leave, but I can't work. And I don't know how long I'm going to be able to, work because I have no idea what my life is going to be like. So, um, during that process, I started it was like this identity shift. Like I was really excited to get back. I really felt like I was like, yeah, you're going to go back to work. And I just realized I was like, I have no control and I have no idea what this means for me. Like, am I not going to be counseling? Am I, what am I supposed to do with this? And I would tell myself and tell God, I'm like, there's no way I'm going to be working with families that went through pediatric cancer. This is way too close for me. Like, I don't think I could handle that. And as time would go, weeks, we got his first scans, and like right before his first scans, about 2 weeks into the chemo treatment, I just kept feeling this like, you need to be talking about this. You need to be documenting everything that you're going through. You are a therapist, you have tools under your belt that you can share, but you can also share the fact that it's something that even if you were a therapist, it's hard to cope through. And so even knowing that as a therapist, I was struggling, I'm like, man, like I at least have some of these, like, don't think of this, think of this way, reframe, do that. But other people don't have that. And I was like, people who don't have that, like one, they're going to feel shame that they feel certain ways, or they're going to struggle trying to understand what they're going through. And if I could just impart a little bit of what I know and what I feel and what I personally have experienced, I can help other people through sharing, my story essentially. And so my son went into, he had to get 6 weeks of radiation therapy. And by that point, I had decided, I'm like, okay, I guess I'm doing this. I guess I'm going to start a podcast and to talk about mental health and pediatric cancer. My husband's like, why would you do that? I was like, it's coping. It's me coping. I was like, this is my way of processing what I'm going through. He thought I was loony, but he's like, okay, whatever, if this is your outlet, go for it. And so I started podcasting and then blogging kind of simultaneously. We kind of shared that before we started recording, but basically at the same time, because I do always write, and I would just constantly would write on my phone or just processing feelings. And so I decided I'm just going to put it all on a website and try and reach two different audiences, whether people who like to listen to podcasts or people who like to read blogs. And so that's a little bit about what I do. And I've been, this is actually the month of March is 1 year that family chemotherapy started, and been doing things since then. And it's been a blessing. It's been a real blessing to be able to help other families going through pediatric cancer. So yeah.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because when Emily went through cancer, that we didn't have this stuff. Like there was nobody like you that I could have listened to or read a blog on or anything like that. And so it's been really cool for me to see over the last, even just a handful of years, people using the podcasting platform to reach other parents, because there's something I think very comforting to. It's different when somebody says, I'm a therapist, I'm a licensed clinical therapist, and let me support you and teach you how to do these things, versus, yes, I have these tools, but I'm also a mom who had that moment of your child has cancer.
Yeah.
And unless you have had that happen to you, no matter how well-meaning other people are, there is that feeling like you just don't understand. Where with you, it's like, no, you do understand. You and I share that. We both have that moment. And there's something comforting to know, like, you get that, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's amazing that you can then, like you said, use the tools that you had, and to also say, wow, I had all these tools, I had all this education, and this was still really hard on me mentally.
Yep. And that was the big message that I feel like I wanted to communicate was, this is really hard. Like, this is really, really hard. And it's normal to feel like you're struggling in this.
nobody prepares you. There's no parenting classes. It's no, I mean, think about when you give birth, right? You go to Lamaze, you read all the books, you have the books on birthing the baby, the books on what to expect the first years, the books on, everything. And there's no book. I mean, that was a big thing of why I just did a podcast, not a podcast. Yeah, I guess it was a podcast this afternoon for somebody. And when we were talking about that, I said, I just wanted a book, a how-to book.
Yes.
Like, how do I do this?
Me too.
So that's kind of how mine evolved. It was like, I wish I had a how-to book, and there wasn't anything. And so, the mental health piece, I think, is really huge because, and we've talked about this before on Making Cancer Fun, about how it's the parents and the siblings who have a higher rate of PTSD than the actual child. And there's all of these resources for the children, right? They're in the hospital, they have a child life team, they have, maybe their therapist or whatever. And the parents are like the ones who are most traumatized and have probably the least amount of resources. And it was interesting because Emily and I were doing the podcast this afternoon, and they were kind of asking her, like, what do you remember, right?
Mm-hmm.
She's now 15, or she'll be 15 next month. And the stuff that she remembers is probably like this much compared to, I remember everything, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, I'm so grateful that she doesn't really remember a lot of stuff. She does. Like, I think people are surprised how much she does remember. But as parents, we remember everything.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's where that mental health piece is so important. So I know that one of the things with the family chemotherapy is that you really talk about like how the entire family needs mental health support. Can you kind of explain that a little bit more? And then I know you have, tips as far as like, this is what you had wished you knew earlier on. So if it's a family who's maybe in a new diagnosis or kind of still in the midst of it, like, what can you share with those families of, this is maybe what I should have been, not should have, but I wish I had been doing or wish I had known? Yeah.
So when I started, or when I, when we started this journey, it's like, I can't find another word other than journey that really describes what we go through. Journey. And I know, like, it's one of those words that some people are like, I hate that word because this is not, whatever. They don't like using the word journey, but I'm like,
now I have to look that word up while you're talking.
I'm like, a season of my life. When we entered this season of our life, and we were dealing with the diagnosis, I am one of those people who likes to pick up a book and be like, okay, what do I need to be prepared for? How do I handle this? Like, down to how do I tell my kids? Like, how do I explain in age appropriate ways that their sibling has cancer? Like you mentioned, the child has this huge team, at his feet, and the siblings and the parents are kind of left to fumble through the actual unseen side effects of pediatric cancer diagnosis. And what I mean by that is, you're talking about your marriage. I mean, the stress that it puts on your marriage in all aspects, like not just like how you relate to your spouse, but also intimacy. And I mean, like, intimacy. I'm not talking about like, oh yes, like we get each other on a very deep and personal level. I'm talking about your 3-letter word, intimacy.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking like, who's really turned on while your kid's going through
exactly
cancer?
Right.
I mean, I'm single, but I'm thinking, who would be? I don't care how much you love that person. Like, you've got so much weight and stress on your mind. Who's thinking like, yeah, let's. Although I do know a family that they got pregnant in the middle of the bone marrow transplant unit, and we were joking. They were like, well, I guess they were relieving stress back there. Because,
exactly.
That's
right. But like, not only that, but like, how do you have those conversations? Like, how do you approach your spouse when one person might be processing one way? And so all these aspects of our lives that are affected by pediatric cancer, like our friendships change, and your support system changes. And for me personally, even though I had to learn how to put boundaries, because drama doesn't stop, apparently. People don't just say, oh, that person's going through cancer, so we're going to make their life really, where it should be, as easy as it should be. Because there are some people around that still like to ruffle feathers. And so learning how to put some really big boundaries during that, it just, all the areas of our lives were affected. Friendships, relationships, financial, me leaving my job created, this, even if I just went back for a week, it was like semi-identity crisis that I went through, that I was like, what am I, like, I get that I'm going to be, I guess I'm a caregiver now. Like, that's it. I mean, it's the most important job. Don't get me. It's not just
But it's
that's
an
it.
identity crisis,
Yeah.
right? Particularly if
You
you've
literally,
gone to school and you've invested in your education and this is your career, and then to see that kind of change.
right. And you're like, I have no idea what this means for me. Like, is this
Yeah.
1 year? Like, you know, are we going to come out the other side together still? Or like, what does this mean? And so there's just so many different areas that I felt that were impacted, that I was like, I have to write about this. I just got to share the message with people that are going through this, because there is no book that can walk you through. I mean, you go to support groups, but your support groups, we didn't actually get the benefit of the support group because we were only 24 hours for hospital stays for chemo. And so we didn't really have that support system. And so there was no external outside of the hospital support system for, you know, dealing through a pediatric cancer diagnosis, and finding a therapist for my other children, other than my cancer kid, because he had the lady at the hospital. But when I was like, hey, can I bring the sibling to you? And she's like, no, I'm sorry. We only treat kids that are in the hospital. And you're like, all right, well, now who am I going to find that's actually familiar with how that's impacting my child,
Yeah.
And
So I looked up while you were talking the word journey, because I'm a big word person. I'm kind of nerdy this way. I love words and what the energy is. And this is actually very interesting as far as a verb. If you take journey as a verb, it comes from the mid 14th century, and it said to travel from one place to another. And so I really do feel that does describe the childhood cancer, because you're in one place and you're traveling to a different place, and you don't know where that place is going to be. It's going to be with your child, without your child. What is that place going to be? And you're in this journey. So you're in this traveling, right?
Yeah.
Like, so I actually think that totally does very, very well size up if somebody doesn't like that word, but that's really what it is. You're traveling from one place in your life into another. And when you get to where when you get there, even if you have a child, we're 10 years out, that traveling certainly changes who you are by
Yes,
the time you get to this new place. You are leaving one place and you are showing up someplace different.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think journey is a great word.
We'll use journey then.
Yeah. So what are the things that you really wish you had known at that time? I know you recently blogged about this, so guys, if you're watching, you can certainly go to the Family Chemotherapy blog. But for those who are watching, what are the things that you wish you maybe had started doing earlier on?
Yes. So I did write a blog, things that I wish I had known at the diagnosis. And I'm going to kind of give you the list of what I listed on there. And it's not all inclusive, right? Because I'm really wordy. I'm just like, I'm a talker. I write, I'm wordy. So I'm like, I kind of limit this as much as I can. So I felt like one of the most important things when I'm sure you do as well. Like, basically I have a lot of people that refer their friends who have a, first time diagnosis into the cancer world. They send them over to me, and usually like some of the things that I feel that have been what I typically tell these parents, other than, I'm so sorry, I'm here for you. It's really, one, join a community. I think is one of the most important things to me for some reason. I feel like without connecting with other cancer parents, it was the most isolating thing. Like I had no idea what I was doing. And it was hard because people would, especially at the beginning, it was really hard for me to connecting with other parents. And sometimes you get connected with parents. You don't know, you just know that they have the same, went through pediatric cancer. And sometimes you're connected with a parent whose child didn't survive, right? And that's really hard when you're at the very beginning of a cancer diagnosis. You're like, it's so sobering. And so I for one am one of those is like, get online. There's so many communities on Facebook. Obviously there's Moncology, but for me, I think the most important one, and that was so instrumental to this whole process for us, was joining a very cancer specific community. So I joined a group for rhabdomyosarcoma. Those people are my tribe. I can talk to them about everything that my child is going through, all the side effects, all the symptoms, the treatment plans, just on that level, basically, of what I really need to know, how to advocate for my kid. Because one of the things that we do learn is that doctors are just that. They have a lot of training in what they know, but there's still so much that they don't know, in this,
They're just people.
they're just people with a lot of experience, basically, but they don't know it all. And each doctor has a different level of knowledge and experience. Yeah. So the cumulative of the group, it's like, here's what this doctor wants to do. Is this aligned with other people, with other doctors? Is this the best course for my child? So joining a community that's cancer specific to me is probably one of the top ones. You're going to get a wealth of information, and that's more learning how to advocate for your child by joining those communities. The other one is I really appreciate the doctor when I asked, here we are sitting in a little tiny room and for 2 hours, and she's telling us all about cancer and the type of diagnosis and the treatment and all that other stuff. And, not every parent does this, but I think the majority of us ask, what's the prognosis? Like, what are the chances of survival here? Prepare me, especially people like planners like me. I like to be prepared. I don't like surprises. So I don't like people hiding things from me. So I'm like, just be upfront with me so I know how to prepare myself. And, the lady said to me, it's either 0% or 100%. There is no middle. And I can give you the number, but it's not going to make a difference. It's going to be, each child is different, biologically different, how his body responds to things, environmentally, personality wise. So I can give you the number, but that number doesn't mean anything other than it's 0% or 100%. Yeah. And so I like, that was, one of my top ones is the odds of survival doesn't mean anything. And that really is sometimes hard to remind yourself when you're in certain groups, these cancer groups that we join and whatnot. It's hard to hear when other children do pass away from cancer, because you're thinking, oh my gosh, that kid is same diagnosis, same area. You start applying the similarities, but children are so different. And so reminding yourself when you start going down that rabbit hole of that kid's diagnosis was similar and they didn't fare well, like not applying that to your child and to your family's story, that everyone has a 0% or 100% chance. And I think you and I had talked about this, like, why not be the 100%, And
that was my mantra. It was, if someone's kid, because what I remember thinking, and the doctor had said this to me, and I love that. I'm going to start using that 0% and 100%. I just think that's beautiful, because what they were saying with me is that even if you're the person who has the 90% survival rate, what if you end up being that 10%? And then that's almost worse, because you're like, wait, they had a 90% survival rate, right? And if you have a 1% survival rate, still that one, right? And so my whole mantra became the whole time, like, if someone's kid's going to survive, why not mine? Someone's going to be the miracle. Someone's going to be the one that defies the odds. Like, why not my kid? If it's going to be somebody, why not mine? And I must have repeated that to myself over and over and over again. And it's interesting. And I hadn't thought about this in a long time. I remember Emily was done with treatment, but she was still in that very close follow-up, and we were going in for a scan. And obviously, we all get, particularly when you're just right out of treatment, every time you do a scan is like, terrifying.
Hold your breath.
Yeah. And I remember sitting in the room, and she was going in for her scan, and a family that we knew came in, and their daughter had been out. I don't know if it was 8 months or 6 months or whatever it was, but she had been done with treatment. And they came in, and I was like, why are you guys here? Like, you're done, right? Mm-hmm. And it turned out that she had an earache, and the earache was just cancer everywhere. Mm-hmm. And now it was, we don't really know what we're going to do. Like, it had been, and she had been done. So she was one of those kids that I was like, oh, look, she's done. She's good. And here she is in a relapse that I openly, I don't know what happened long term with her. We were, not in touch, and social media and stuff was different then, but it shook me to my core.
Yeah.
And I remember my daughter was getting her scans and she was under sedation. And then when I went back in there and she was laying in the bed, and I was like physically shaking. And I was like, oh my gosh, what if there's cancer in there and I can't see it? Because that's what had happened to this other kid, right? They couldn't find it, and then they found it. And what if there's like ravaged cancer in her, and we just don't know, and this scan is going to show it. And I was physically shaking. And a friend of mine called, and I write about this in the book, and he's like, I don't know if you know where we're getting scans. He's like, how are you? And all of a sudden I was like, and nobody is prepared to how to handle childhood cancer vomit on them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm in the hospital, this kid, and they had a relapse, and Emily's here, and what if there's cancer all over her and everything? And he's like, and all he said to me is, he said this kid's name, and he said, D, that's not her name, but D initial, like, D is not M. And that was it. And that was all he said. He's like, that's not M. And it was that moment of being, where you're in that panic mode and your brain is in little reptile brain taking over. And all of a sudden it was like, right, that's not my kid. It doesn't matter. And it's not horrified and heartbroken for this family.
Yeah.
But this is not my kid. And my kid is my kid. And it really grounded me, and to constantly remember, like, okay, but that's not your kid. And so I love what you're saying about, every child is different. Every child's circumstance is different. And it's tough. We can't look left. We really have to have those blinders on.
We do. And that is definitely a challenge to do, I think. For some people it's harder. And so, like, for people that do join communities and they start noticing that it's something very difficult for them, then I always encourage them to get off the community, because I'm like,
it's interesting you say that. I think that's smart, because there's some, I find, and somebody's very removed now from the treatment, when I see somebody say, can I be, moved to a bereaved group, or it triggers me. And I think, and I have said this, in some ways, I'm very grateful that we didn't have those Facebook communities and stuff back then, because while I see the value in hearing from other parents, I can't imagine how triggering that would be for me, because Em was in treatment for, like, she was in, you were talking about 24 hours for you guys.
Mm-hmm.
We were really like checked in, moved in, the hospital was the hotel kind of thing.
Yeah.
And everybody that we became very close to did lose their children. And I remember feeling like, does anybody survive? Everybody I know around me who I've met, who I've become close to, has lost their child. And I don't know anybody who's surviving. And so I think you're right. You have to really kind of guard yourself that if seeing these posts or hearing people's relapse stories, like the relapse ones were triggering for me.
Yeah.
Right. And to be like, it's not that I don't care, and it's not that I don't want to be sympathetic, but you need to kind of put a veil of protection, I think, around your brain.
Yeah, for sure.
So I really love that 0, 100. I think that's beautiful. I'm going to start sharing that. I love that. You can't get caught up in the stats, because miracles don't have stats, right?
Exactly.
And you always have a miracle kid. So I think that's beautiful. So what's another one that you wish you had done? So we have kind of join the community, look for community, but be careful in the community. Yeah. Don't listen to the stats, because not relevant to your child. What else?
The unseen side effects, I think I kind of touched base on that a little bit, how it affects everybody in the family. And so being cognizant of, not only is your cancer child in need of the love and attention and mental health support, but also you, your spouse, or your significant other, the grandparents. I mean, the grandparents also, I think some other hospitals do way better than, some of the smaller ones. I know up in the Boston, I think, area, they have more grandparent support groups and stuff like that, but we don't have a lot of that in the other hospitals that I've been to. And so being aware that it affects everybody in the family. And I had a hard time being aware of that at times, that like, I felt like it was just such a personal thing for me, that people couldn't feel the depth of my pain that I was going through, but they were going through their own pain watching as a bystander, where they couldn't help, like they could just watch. And I think it impacted them in their own ways too, So yeah, I think all the members of your family, whether direct or indirect, and your friends and stuff like that, there are those side effects that nobody tells you about when you enter this world. You just kind of learn it as you go. And some people have really amazing support systems and really great parents who are just like super supportive, and, you know, that's awesome. You know, they have friends that reach out, but for other families, that's not always the case. And, you know, not every family gets the equal amount of support. And so, um, but cancer has an impact regardless of the amount of support you have around you. And I just want to, you know, bring light to that everybody in the family is going to have an impact. Even if you think that you're like, I know a lot of women complain about their spouse and their spouse doesn't really talk about it. And they just handle it differently, or they don't, you know, it's almost like they're just not grieving the way that a parent, you know, one parent grieves. And one thing that I do know is like grief is so individual, you know, and even if you haven't lost a child, you're still grieving. You're grieving this life that you used to have. You're grieving the fact that you used to live naively, that maybe you had that mother anxiety that, yeah, you know, like worst case scenario, if something ever happens to my kid, but now you're literally faced with something could happen to my kid and it's life or death right now. And so you're no longer living in this like naive little bubble where you can kind of slap away the, you know, unhealthy thoughts that are just like typical mom anxiety. Now it's literally something that you're dealing with. And so there is that grief that you have in those situations, the loss of how, you know, you're grieving how life used to be lived and now it's not being lived the same way. Like you literally, your life goes from living it in one, we're creatures of habit, I guess is what I'm trying to say. We're creatures of habit, and we're used to doing things in a routine. When you add something new to your routine, like a workout, it takes a while to adjust, right? Like you're adding weights onto a little raft that obviously you got to try and find the right balance to make sure that it doesn't just like completely flip over. But that's not what happens in pediatric cancer. We're literally just like, hey, by the way, we're just going to flip you upside down. And now you have to figure out what needs to stay, what has to go, and live a new life. And you're going to have to grieve that no longer are you living this life that you used to live, you know, and not only just.
And then it's not going to go back.
And it's not going to go back. The routine, you might be able to somewhat go back to a normal sense, but that anxiety, you know, will always be there. And just everything that you've been through has changed the way that you view the world.
Yeah, your perspective completely changes. I mean, I hope, and I obviously for people who are still kind of in the throes, I will say this is somebody who's out of that you grow to have an appreciation for that change in perspective. Yeah. And it's interesting that you use the word grief. Number one, I never really thought about it. That's why I was getting emotional as you were talking about this. I never thought of the grief of the family members in my family. You're right. I only thought about me, and this is my child, and I'm going to lose my child, and not how that was affecting my sister or my brothers or my cousin or the other people around, and probably owe them a text at some point of being like, hey, I never appreciated how hard this was on you too, right? Because you were just in your survival mode. And that grief, that there's a grief for the loss of the innocence that you had before cancer became part of your life. Yeah. And that's okay. What I'm really hearing is that's okay to acknowledge that grief, and there's not a right way to grieve or a wrong way to grieve, but that it is a grief for everybody, right? Yeah. It's kind of how, like I say to people, when you get divorced, even a good divorce, like mine was a necessary divorce because of the situation and the domestic violence and everything. And I still remember being, the day my divorce was finalized, just sobbing outside of the courthouse, and my whole family couldn't understand. They were like, finally you got your name back, and after going through this horrific year and everything. But it was so filled with grief of the loss of the life that I thought I was going to have, that I wasn't going to have. And so when you said that, that's very much how I think childhood cancer feels too. You're grieving this loss of what you thought your life would look like, what you thought your child's life would look like.
Precisely.
And even if they survive, it's not going to be the life that you thought. I mean, my daughter, 10 years later, right? She's still, I say, like, every day when she gets changed, she sees those scars. Every day when she puts her hearing aids in, right? Every year when she has to go to the survivor's clinic, like, there's just a different, you do appreciate that there's gifts in there, right? There's
Yes.
good things that came out of that, and there's beautiful things that came out of it. But would you ever choose those things over not having had cancer? Never, right?
Right. I
Like, I don't
know.
care how many gifts are in there. You're still like, it would be better if that had not happened, you know? So yeah, I think that's acknowledging that is really very interesting. And obviously, as a single person, I had a different perspective of what you guys were going through as a couple,
Yeah.
you know, and some of the different struggles. And there's good and bad, right? There were struggles that I was kind of making these decisions by myself, but then the struggle of I'm keeping my relationship together, and maybe we have different opinions about what we should do, and you know, that's a whole other.
Yep. And luckily, like, my husband and I have one of our, I mean, obviously, you know, me being a therapist, and I think he's just an amazing listener, and just he's just a very level-headed guy. And so, I mean, we were able to work through most of that pretty well, but there were still times that, you know, it was still a struggle. And so it's like, I know you hear it either makes a couple stronger or it makes them,
Oh,
you know, fall apart. And I'm
yeah.
like, no, wait. Let's stop that thought process right there. Let's just debunk that myth. Like,
Okay.
these people that it makes them stronger, I guess, maybe, you know, like, it can definitely unite people, because trauma does have a way of uniting people. Like, when you watch movies, a lot of times, you know, they're like, oh, these two people went through something really traumatic, like they got stuck on an island or whatever, like the Titanic, for example, right? They're like falling in love in the middle of this super traumatic experience. But like, people do tend to create bonds, like very strong bonds, when they go through trauma. But when you're already a couple, sometimes it doesn't really work that way, you know? Like, you've already got patterns of how you communicate with one another, and it doesn't mean that there's not going to be conflict. You're still going to have conflict while you're going through something very difficult. And how you handle conflict as a married couple is going to be really brought to the light and exacerbated in the way that, like, if you don't do it well, it's going to be even worse when you're in the middle of cancer. It could be, not in all situations, right? Maybe it could definitely make you guys be like, we need to get our beep together and figure it out how to, like, co-parent really well. But yeah, it's not either or. It's not like the people that do get stronger, that they didn't get stronger without the conflict, because that's what truly creates a stronger marriage, is when you're able to work through that conflict together. And it doesn't mean that they have this beautiful resolution that they're both like, I love your idea, we're compromising, this is beautiful. Sometimes it's, man, like, I'm very adamant that this is what I think needs to happen, and they disagree with me, and I gotta honor his opinion and whatever, right? So it's never like this beautiful, like, resolved, we can go to the next thing, we're such an awesome couple. Like, sometimes it's compromising, and you have to figure out who gets the upper hand on the situation. So
well, and I would think too, you know, again, not being in that situation, but you already feel so out of control.
Yeah.
And then that feels like, now this is one more place I don't have control, because I've got this person and their opinion, right? And you're already grasping for whatever control you can have. So I think, you know, that's really, and I remember, because I, you know, particularly when I was making some more of the, you know, the decisions where they make you sign 37 pages that you won't see because it's the decision you're making, those kind of decisions, and you're literally making a life or death decision for another human, right, for your child. And I remember saying to my mom, you know, and I have a very severe situation with her father. We had restraining orders and everything. So there was not any, okay, we can even communicate, right?
Yeah.
And I had sole decision making for medical stuff. And I remember at one time saying to my mom, I just wish I had somebody else that I could talk to, who loves this child equally as I do, who's their child. Like, my mom was great and she was supportive, but it's still not her child, right?
Yeah.
To be like, well, what do you think we should do? Because I feel like I'm making this decision totally on my own, and I don't want this responsibility. And then my mom reframed, right? And she said, but what if you had two different opinions?
Yep.
At least, you know, whatever you want, that's what's going to go. And so, as hard as that is, I can appreciate the fact that while I didn't want all of the responsibility, I never had to fight for what I wanted, because it was my decision. And I would imagine that that is a whole other level of stress of I feel strongly about this and you equally feel strongly about this, and we both have equal say. And
Yeah,
what if one person chooses and then things don't go well, right? And now the resentment
exactly.
and all of that. And so I love when you talk about the family chemotherapy, because I say all the time, childhood cancer is a family diagnosis.
Yes.
And it affects everybody. And that mental health piece, that every single person should be getting their own counseling and their own support, and
That's
not
right.
just, the mom, or not just the kiddo, or the sibling and stuff.
And that actually goes, if I'm going to segue, that was going to be my next tip, which was going to be don't wait until treatment is over to get help.
Okay.
Because I think many times it's hard to find the time to meet with a therapist. Now during
Yeah.
coronavirus, I think it's easier for parents to take that notion and kind of throw it out the door and say, well, there is a therapist that's willing to work with me, and there are therapists who are willing to work late evenings when your child is asleep in the bed or whatever, right? Or early mornings. So because of all the virtual visits, it makes it easier. But I do think one of the things that you said is that here you are dealing with pediatric cancer, and then you start realizing that other areas of your life begin to lose control. And that's actually one of the things that I've realized when I was doing family chemotherapy, the podcast, and I started thinking of all the people who I wanted to bring on, kind of through my own experience, through other people that I've come to know, and just the general, like, what's the general population seem to be anecdotally, struggling with. And you start seeing that it's like your marriage, like, luckily, my husband and I, obviously, we have our ways of communicating, but there were still moments where I had to take hard looks at myself. Be like, I remember
Yeah.
thinking to myself, and I'm just gonna be very blunt and open about this, but there was a moment in my life where I had to say, before, my husband and I used to go on dates, and we had date nights, and it was good. I'm like, I really wouldn't want to date myself right now. Like, if I were to go on a date, the conversation would revolve around cancer, or what our life, like, our life was in shambles essentially, And so it's like, it was really this moment that I was like, well, Adriana, you would you want to date yourself with where you're at right now? And then that was when I was like, you know what? I need
Wow.
to do things for myself to make myself happy, and to take care of myself, and not just make my whole life about cancer. And I know, like, a mother told me that once. She was like, oh, don't be one of those moms. Like, she's been in this, like, for several years, and she was like, you can tell she's jaded by it, And so she's like, don't be one of those moms who makes cancer your whole world. And you're just like,
But cancer is my whole world.
cancer is my whole world. Exactly.
Yeah.
But like, so like hearing that, and then just at the same time thinking to myself, like, what does that really mean for me?
Yeah.
And how am I applying cancer into all areas of my life? And so when I picked up this hobby of doing family chemotherapy, I'm talking about cancer all the time. And my husband, sometimes he's like, I don't understand, because I'm writing a book as well, the survival guide, right, as a parent. And so
I
I'm
love
like
it.
writing this book, and I asked him a question one day, and he's like, I don't understand how you could write a book like that. Isn't that like re-traumatizing you and triggering you? And I'm like, no, it's the most therapeutic thing for me to write about my experience, and like create, I don't know, writing is, in itself is one of the best therapies in the world, because you can process a very traumatic experience with emotion and logic, and put them together, and put words to emotions that maybe you didn't realize that you had, and just explore things, set it aside if it's too much. And so it's a very therapeutic way of processing things. So he's like, isn't this traumatic for you? And I'm like, no. But to him, that's not how he copes with the cancer diagnosis. He has his own way. And so, kind of back to this whole entire marriage thing, it's like you're two different people. You grieve in different ways, you process differently. And so that doesn't mean that you can't get along, or that you can't respect that person just maybe doesn't want to talk about it. So find somebody else that you do that will be willing to talk to you about it. Like, I can't make him want to talk about something
Yeah.
that's really difficult for him. And so yeah, so that's a little bit about that. So not waiting until you're done with treatment to get therapy is so important, because your marriage is going to be impacted. Your interaction with your children is going to be impacted, and just what the day to day seems to look like, and your anxiety and, grieving, yada, yada, yada. I did say yada, 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 but, all of that is so much to just say, you know what, I'm going to handle that when I'm done with cancer. Because if you're not addressing those issues when they're smaller, they're just going to snowball. They can snowball to the point where it's like you create such tremendous division between you and your spouse, or this disconnect between you and your children. So it's important to be, very cognizant of how you are processing coping through cancer and getting the help that you need, because your spouse isn't going to be the person that you need to talk to. Like, as much as we say, some people are like, well, I've got friends who are willing to talk to me. I think for me, I have the benefit that a lot of my friends, I have close friends who are therapists. So they knew not to minimize some of that stuff. And so I have a hard time picking who I unload on, because I want to feel validated and not feel dismissed, and not given those, like, your platitudes of it's okay, they're going to be okay. Because I'm like, well, you don't know that. Are you God? Do you know if my child's going to come out on the other side and be 100% okay? You can't really guarantee that. So like,
you don't know.
So there's, people that I had a hard time wanting to share with, because I'm like, I know these people mean well, but it just created a certain level of like frustration in me, where I'm like, I'm not feeling heard. I'm not feeling validated, so.
And nobody knows how to do that, right?
Exactly.
Nobody knows what to say. It's like, you even feel bad being like, talking to people, because you know that you don't know how to respond. How do they expect to respond, right? And so what do people do? They say things that they think will make you feel better. Like the big one I always got was, well, God doesn't give you what you can't handle. And I remember being like, if somebody says to me again, I'm going to vomit on them. Like, because it felt very triggering. Like, oh, I'm a strong person, so I'm the one who deserves to have my kid with cancer. Is that what you're telling me? Like,
I had someone tell me that too.
Yeah. I mean, I know that they meant well, but it was very like, and I had to have grace of people don't know what to say. And they want to help. So I know we have a few minutes left, but what's your last tip?
Practicing self-care during all of this. So
that's a loaded one. What as a therapist and a mom who's been through there, what does it actually look like for you? Like, what would that mean?
Honestly, it comes to, I know parents like you, for example, who were stuck in the hospital for a very, extended period of time. That means trying to pick up a new hobby, whether it be journaling is something that's really important that you could do, that you can carry with you, whether it be on your phone or actual physically writing something, or on a laptop, whatever, right? But journaling would be a really good way to practice self-care. It's taking care of those emotions instead of having them jumble up in here. Put them on paper, handle it, close the book, come back to it. Don't think about the thoughts anymore. It could be talking with friends, meeting up with friends when you can, having somebody come and take care of your children or something, so you can get away and have a date night with your spouse. Like that's been really hard for COVID families that are probably more on the less risky type. I'm trying to word this correctly. Like we were in the middle of COVID when all this happened. And so like my husband and I we still kind of live this lifestyle where we're just still very cautious of coronavirus. And so finding ways to have date nights has been a struggle. But date nights are really important in asking people, like, I really need somebody to come and watch my kid, finding someone that you trust enough to be able to watch your kid.
That's tough.
Yeah.
Right.
And if you can't get out,
and all of that,
and if you can't get out, it's saying it's Friday night, let's have a date, set up all the TVs, let's put our electronics away, grab some wine glasses or whatever. Like, you make a really nice meal, or I make a really nice meal. My husband likes to make the steaks for us. So I say, like, if it's a steak, steak night, but practicing self-care with painting your nails, like doing your hair, getting your hair done. I haven't cut my hair in 2 years. It's like the worst. I'm like sitting here preaching to you like self-care, but I'm just too
Oh my
afraid
gosh,
to
and
get
I'm
out to
thinking
the
your hair
salon.
looks so beautiful. So
Oh,
I'm like,
it's
why
like
haven't
down
you
to my
done it?
butt.
It's so beautiful. It's
I'm
so
like,
gorgeous.
um,
No, it's beautiful.
thank you.
Unless
So
you're cutting it to donate it, and then I'm in full
exactly.
support.
I have, yeah, I'm planning on cutting it to donate it and already have like another lock of hair. And now that I'm in this
Wow.
world, now I'm like, okay, you guys tell me actually who I need to send it to, because,
Yeah.
but back in the day, like before, I still have this bag. We moved in the middle of all of that. Like we had just moved into our house when my son got diagnosed. And so I have this like bag with a lock of hair that's like a foot long.
Oh my
And
God.
so anyway, so yeah, so self-care, getting your hair done,
Yeah.
doing your nails, listening to music, setting time aside for meditation. I really think like, I know you're really a big advocate and proponent for essentially like mindset positivity. And I do think that that is one of the most important elements of self-care is like what I call thought stopping. When you catch yourself going down the negative rabbit trail, stop, just stop.
Yes.
And you don't have to necessarily say, I'm going to find the silver lining. It's not about finding the silver lining. It's literally just saying, I'm going to take my focus and think on something that makes me happy. What
Yep.
makes me happy? My child's smiling. Look at him over there playing with his toys, or he's smiling, or whatever, right? Think happy thoughts. And thought stopping is so important because it's insane how powerful our brains are, and the way that once you have one negative thought, it just opens up that pathway to, allow more negative thoughts, and it just continues to attract all this like negativity. And so thought stopping is really important. So self-care is either getting out with people, learning to practice, controlling your mind and your mindset around this trauma, and connecting with other people, and finding a hobby for yourself. And for me, the podcast was one way of doing an outlet, to allow myself to kind of process verbally and externally what I was going through. And it kept my mind from, thinking negative thoughts. So
I have to say, and we didn't talk about this ahead of time, so I just love this because I've never heard that term, thought stop. And this is the second thing that you've actually taught me, and you might not know that, because I do things that I have always learned how to do through being in the personal development world, right?
mhm.
But I never knew they had a term. And you bring in being a licensed clinical social worker and your therapy background and everything, and then you're like, well, that's what this is. So the first thing that you taught me, which is something that I have done probably my whole life just naturally, but never knew it had a word, is reframing. So
Yes.
I take every experience and I go, okay, how can I reframe this so it looks different to me? I can't change the picture, but I'm going to put a new frame on it. And obviously, anybody watching this knows that my frame was fun, right? We're going to reframe this. We're going to use. I used gratitude to reframe. I used fun to reframe. And then when I met you, I'm like, oh, there's a real word for that. I didn't know that that's what I was doing. And now you've given me another one because I've never heard that term, thought stopping. So I knew, because of my background with neuroplasticity and understanding how the brain works. And I've kind of, I say to people a lot of times, most people don't ever think about what they think about. They think that their thoughts just go wild and they never stop to go, well, wait, what am I actually thinking about? And I use the wheelbarrow analogy a lot, that if you went into a backyard and you had a wheelbarrow and you wanted to go from point A to point B, the first time you took the wheelbarrow down and the ground was solid, it would be tough. You'd have to really work to balance the wheelbarrow and to hold it, and it might be heavy and you'd have to kind of push it down. But the next day, if you went out and you followed that same route, it would be a little bit easier because you'd have a little bit of a mark of where the ground. And then if you did that day after day after day, eventually you would dig it so deep that really with almost no effort, you could stick that wheel in the wheelbarrow and get to point A to point B. And that's actually like how our brain works, that when you have a thought, you have your synapses and it fires from point A to point B and point A to point B and point A. And the more you think that thought, the deeper that groove becomes, so that you don't have to think as hard. So it's kind of like if I said, what's your phone number? What's your birthday? What's your name? You have thought that thought so many times that you don't have to even think about it. Your brain just goes point A to point B, that's my phone number. Point A to point B, that's my birthday. And there's some really fascinating research coming out about how people who complain, they actually rewire these grooves in their brain to make it easier and easier to complain. And so I knew that if I think these negative thoughts, it will become easier and easier to go down that negative, because I'm literally training my brain to think those thoughts. And so I was taught that the way to change that thought was to say, cancel, cancel. And that's something that the person, well, from Dallas, Texas, Mary Kay Ash, used to teach her Salesforce. You say, cancel, cancel, and then you replace it with a new thought. But I've never heard it that saying that cancel, cancel is thought stopping. I love that term. So as soon as I would start to go down the scary wheelbarrow road, I would go cancel, cancel. And then for me, because the other part of it too is it's not just canceling that strand, it's rerouting it into a different direction. So how you were sharing, like you have to choose to think something different. So for me, I took a mantra, and mine was I had a couple of different ones, but I took a mantra that I could remember all the time very easily. So like one of them we had talked about before, like why not me? If someone's kid's going to live, why not me? So as soon as I would go, I go cancel, cancel. If someone's kid's going to live, why not me? If someone's going to live, why not mine? And I would just repeat that over and over and over again. I also, and we share, a faith as Christians, I also had a scripture that I believe was God, and I do believe was God's, promise to her. And so when my brain would go down that way, I would repeat her scripture verse over and over and over again. And so I've never thought about that, Adriana, and I love this, and I am so thrilled because we did not plan this, but that you consider thought stopping self-care.
Yes.
I've never thought of it that way. That makes me want to cry. I'm so happy because that is so beautiful to say, taking care of my thoughts is actually practicing self-care. And you don't need to leave a hospital room to do that. You don't need to join a gym to do that. You don't need to put on a candle, a bubble bath, a spray some aromatherapy. It is something that anybody at any time can do to take care of yourself. And that is beautiful. And to be able to teach your children to do that, to take care of themselves, right? So I love that. I did not tell her to say that. I promise. That was totally, I've never thought of it. So these are the two things I've learned from her. Reframing. That's what we want to do. Number two, we want to thought stop. How cool is that? And that your thought stopping is your self-care. This is like such gold. I love it.
You talk about the wheelbarrow. What I always like to tell my clients is, I don't know why I'm visual also like you, right? It looks like you like to do visualizations. Mm-hmm. And so in my mind, I think, our brain, when you really look at the brain as a whole, like it's just lots of creases and, it's just mm-hmm. bumps and valleys and all that stuff, right? So I like to think of my brain sometimes and our thoughts as you're going into a forest. So when you imagine this like meadow that you come across, right? It's never been walked through. You clearly start creating a pathway, like you mentioned. You create a pathway, and that is what your neurons are doing. You're creating these, the way that your body automatically learns to process a thought, essentially, right? Or an experience. And so like when you're going up to that meadow and you're like, this is something really traumatic, I have two choices. Do I want to walk down this area or this area? Regardless of which area you choose, you're creating a pathway. So when somebody else comes behind you or you come out and you want to go back, where do you go? The area usually that's already got that pathway that looks like someone's walked there, right? I mean, when we go hiking, where do you go? You don't go off the beaten trail,
you look for the trail,
right? You typically go where the trail is. And so that's what our brains do. Like we tend to go where we see where we've been.
I love that beautiful imagery.
And so instead it's saying, okay, I know I have the choice to make it the pathway where it's positive, or I have the choice to stay down this negative path. And my body is going to learn that it's going to respond negative or positive. So I like to create that, imagery, I guess you could say, to kind of piggyback off of your wheelbarrow, because I've never pushed a wheelbarrow really truly, so I can't really. I'm a city girl.
That's okay. Well, you can picture the wheelbarrow.
Yes, I can totally picture but I'm like, that is such an interesting analogy that I would have never have thought of, because I would even though we actually have a wheelbarrow, so it's like now we have one, but my husband uses it, I don't really use it, and so I'm like, I would have never learned the whole balancing
Yeah, well,
act. You're
and they're
right.
not, they look like they're easy, right? But when
Yeah,
depending on
yeah,
what's in it, it's actually can be kind of heavy and difficult to wheel. So that's why, you try to go the same way all the time. So it
yeah.
gets easier and easier. So I know we're finishing up. And of course we're gonna have all these posted in the notes and everything, but where can people find you? And once your book is done, I hope that you will come back and share your book and let me promote that and share that with people, because I think that these kind of how to survival, how do I cope, what do I do, not just some of these memoir or whatnot, but really practical tools is really needed for parents. So I'm so excited. I can't wait for that to come out
Thank you.
and to be able to share that with our community. But right now, where can people find you?
They can find me. Podcast is Family Chemotherapy. The website is www.familychemotherapy.com, and you can get access to the podcast there, and the articles are there as well. And I'm also on Instagram and on Facebook. Instagram is, the little @ symbol, basically family _ chemotherapy. And then Facebook is just Family Chemotherapy if you look me up there. So those are the main things. And then I'm looking forward to joining your groups on Clubhouse and talking more about things like this, like self-care and just different topics that to open up that discussion and help other people kind of process what they're going through at this point. So
yeah, so we haven't really talked about that yet on Making Cancer Fun. But for those of you who don't know, I'm pretty big on Clubhouse, and it's a new app. It's only for iPhone users. So if you don't have an iPhone or an iPad right now, as of today's date, it's not out for Androids, depending on when you're watching this. But you can go to Clubhouse. My username is just @Tara's Voice. Or they can go to yours. If you scroll down, though, when I think it's the 4th club listed is the Pediatric Playground, and it is a club for families who have a life-changing medical diagnosis. So it could be cancer, but it could be any type of life-threatening diagnosis. So whether it's you're a family member or a nurse or a child life advocate or professional, somebody who supports families that are going through this, and we're creating rooms and having conversations to kind of share this message, a lot of what you're talking about of the mental health piece, the practicing the self-care, the reframing these traumatic experiences so that they don't really make us victims of our circumstances, but they're just simply part of our stories. Teaching people how to respond in those situations versus just being constant reactive mode. So I'm excited for you to be leading some of these conversations and bringing those into the club, and it's going to be very exciting. And this literally just launched. I think this is the first time we're talking about it here. So. Yeah,
excited too.
Excited. So yeah. So thank you so much for being on. If you guys want to comment, tag, obviously you can find Adriana anywhere that she's listed. But thank you for taking the time to be here, to share your story and to share your journey. And I think we all know, how is your son doing now?
He is doing really well. He is 5 months off of treatment now. And he's so far, we're managing some of the side effects, but other than that, he's doing well. He's laughing and playing and being his normal self and really shining, his personality is really coming through. So he's doing well. Thank you.
That's so exciting. Being a kid, being a
kid.
that's what they need. Yeah. So thank you all for watching, and I hope you'll tune in next Wednesday. If you're not subscribed to the newsletter, please do that, because that's how you just go to makingcancerfun.com to subscribe. But that's how you'll find out things like when this book comes out, because we'll put it in the newsletter. So you want to be connected so that you can, find out our upcoming episodes, things like that. So thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.